And it's really great to see everybody here tonight. This is a momentous occasion. The Tower and Street Clock chapter that I represent has been working on this project. Well, Frank Del Greco will tell you for 13 years. Right, Frank? Yep. Okay, got it. All right. And anyway, we are so pleased and so proud to have Quincy finally standing at last in the NAWCC Museum. So it's wonderful. So I'm going to tell you the story of Quincy. So to do that, we had to travel back in time to the year 1887. I can get all this technology working. So imagine what the United States was like back that time. We were still in the Industrial Revolution. Thomas Edison had just perfected the incandescent light bulb just 8 years earlier in 1879. Electricity was coming to the major U.S. cities, but in the small city of Quincy, Illinois, located on the Mississippi River, the only electricity they had at that time was a very small DC generating plant. And the purpose of that was to provide, I just went dark. Purpose of that was to provide an electricity for an early form of street lighting called arc lighting. Arc lighting had 2 carbon electrodes, and literally they'd run electricity through it. The electricity would jump between the electrodes, and it would create a very bright but a very harsh light. But that's what they had. And this is actually this is a street in Quincy during that same time period with one of the arc lights. I'm going to use a lot of artificial intelligence, so I did enhance this photo just a little bit, and you'll see a lot of that as we go on. So Quincy at that same time, 1887, they had a small telephone exchange. You could call your neighbors, friends, but you couldn't you couldn't make a long distance phone call at that time. You could call the local businesses. Well, in 1887, Quincy was very prosperous with a population around 27,000. They were the 3rd largest city in Illinois in 1887. Chicago was larger, Peoria was larger, and then we had Quincy. And the reason Quincy was so prosperous was because something that I alluded to earlier. They were on the Mississippi River, and that gave them access to steamboats that were traveling up and down the Mississippi. Well, steamboats began operating on the Mississippi River in 1810. When Quincy was founded in 1825, there was only 1 steamboat docking each week. By 1850, there were 5 steamboats landing per day, and by 1860, which really about the peak of the steamboats on the Mississippi, they had 8 steamboat landings every day. And with that came prosperity. There was passenger traffic, there was freight being bought and sold, goods and services. But by the late 1850s, something began to change. Glenn will know something about this. Well, that's a steamboat. Glenn doesn't know anything about steamboats, but he does know about railroads. The railroads were expanding across the state of Illinois, and in 1857, the railroad finally arrived in Quincy and gave them a direct connection to Chicago. Well, soon after, the Civil War broke out, and the military pretty much took over all the rails for the movement of transports, goods and troops and supplies. But by the end of the Civil War in 1865, businesses were learning that they could ship goods, freight, a lot cheaper on the rail than they could through the steamboats. Well, that was a huge problem because there were a lot of steamboats on the Mississippi River. So these businesses, they had to pivot, and they changed their business model to attract more passengers rather than freight. So they opened up their inside galley. They called it a salon at the time. And they used that for social gatherings. They used it for dining, entertainment. A lot of gambling was going on. Some of the gambling was illegal on the land, but you could do it on the river. So it became very, very popular. This is folks could catch the steamboats going up and down the Mississippi River. They could ride it for a day. They could ride it for multi-days. There were very elaborate staterooms that were available. They could even link with the railroads and catch a steamboat going up the river and take the rail going back to their hometown. This is an advertising between Hannibal and Quincy. Now, these 2 cities are not very far apart, but in that day, it took a little while to get up there, but you could catch the steamboat at Quincy, and the first one is 9 o'clock, and at 10:45, you could be in Hannibal. You could go see your friends, you could go see family, you could shop, and then later in the afternoon, you catch the steamboat going back to Quincy. And so that was happening a lot. So here's the parlor scene out of a postcard, and again, using artificial intelligence, I'm going to bring that to life just a little bit. It's kind of the 1880s version of our modern cruise ships, is what I consider. Well, this is an 1880 sketch of Quincy, and the city of Quincy did something very smart, I think. They built their downtown very close to the Mississippi River. So when folks were docking, all they had to do was walk 5 to 10 minutes, and they were in town. This is a colorized version, might give you a little better idea of what that looks like. And this is a postcard from the 1880s, and it shows an excursion steamer landing in Quincy, Illinois. They didn't always use the docks. Some of them had their own gangplanks, especially when you had 2 or 3 steamboats arriving at the same time. That's what they had to do. Well, again, with AI, here we go. Folks are coming off. You can see the downtown area just steps away, and off they go. Well, because of the high volume of visitors disembarking from the steamboats and shopping in town, there were a lot of jewelers in Quincy. With a population of 27,000, you wouldn't expect as many as there were, but there were plenty. Well, 2 such jewelers were Oscar Hines and Joseph Rosenthal. In 1886, they were operating a small jewelry store in Quincy, but they were doing so well, they wanted to expand it into a larger one. They found a new storefront located at 5th and Main, again, just steps from the waterfront. And they called their store Hines and Rosenthal, very original. Well, in 1887, Hines and Rosenthal requested, and they received permission from the city of Quincy to install a street clock on the sidewalk in front of their store. Well, what better way to advertise your business than to have a big street clock right in front of your jewelry store and let folks from the waterfront be able to see it and come right to your store? And I'm sure they looked at the offerings from Seth Thomas and E. Howard, what they had at the time, because they were the major suppliers of street clocks in that day. But their street clock came from the Ansonia Clock Company, because this one was, as you just saw, 19 feet tall. It was a good 12 inches higher than anything Seth Thomas or E. Howard offered, and it was much more ornate. Well, that was just the thing they needed to attract their well-heeled customers right to their store. So this is what the catalog showed as that clock in 1880. So that's what they would have ordered it from. Well, with the help of a little artificial intelligence again, we can imagine what the jewelry store looked like. We can even bring it to life just a little bit. I'm sure they're shopping for some very expensive pocket watches, probably solid gold. But we're going to leave Quincy for just a little bit, because I want to tell you the story about the Ansonia Clock Company and their very brief foray into the manufacturing of tower and street clocks. The Ansonia Clock Company dates back to 1850, when the company was formed in an area that later became the city of Ansonia, surprisingly. It was named for Anson Phelps, one of the company's founders. This was the first Ansonia Clock Company factory, and it was built in 1850. It didn't last very long. It was destroyed by fire in 1854. And then between 1854 and 1877, things got a little messy for the company. There were a number of different names for the company, including the Ansonia Brass Company, the Ansonia Brass and Copper Company, Ansonia Brass and Battery Company. Well, this was a clock exhibit in the 1876 U.S. Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. It reads Ansonia Brass and Copper Company. There's a New York reference for Ansonia's New York sales office that was located on Cliff Street. Well, in 1877, the company is incorporated using the original name of the Ansonia Clock Company. The company now had new leadership, and that leadership felt like the company would do better in Brooklyn, New York. And that's what they began to work toward. In April of 1879, construction began on a new factory in Brooklyn. In the spring of 1880, new equipment was in place, and the factory commenced operations. We know that from a newspaper article in 1880 Ansonia Clock Company catalog, Ansonia began to manufacture tower and street clocks in this new factory. In this 1880 catalog, they showed one 2-dial street clock and 3 different models of tower clocks. Unfortunately, after only about 6 months of operation, there was a terrible fire at the factory that left it completely destroyed. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported that 1,200 workers were thrown out of employment. The loss was reported to be in excess of $750,000. Insurance only covered $400,000 of that. There were conflicting reports as to what caused that fire, but it reportedly started either as a gas leak or in the wood drying room. And then the Brooklyn Daily Eagle followed up with what I thought was a very interesting story. It reported that a cable car conductor was walking home about 2 a.m. in the morning after his shift was over, and he was walking by the factory, and he happened to notice that there was fire up on the 2nd or 3rd floor breaking out of the window and coming up. And so in that day, there was a telegraph firebox nearby where you could notify the fire department, but he didn't think to do that. He instead thought he should go find the night watchman. So he ran over to the factory, and apparently he knew where the night watchman office was. He started banging on the door. Nobody came to the door. Apparently the night watchman was out making rounds. So he passed apparently right by the telegraph firebox again, didn't think to call the fire department. Instead, he noticed that there was a liquor store across the street at 2 a.m. in the morning. I kind of think it was a bar, because he ran inside that bar and he started yelling, "Fire, fire, fire!" Well, all of them started coming out of there, and I think it's more than just a liquor store. There was a lot of people there apparently. And so they all run across right by the telegraph firebox, but they didn't turn in the fire alarm. Instead, they got whatever they could use. They broke down the factory door, and they went up 2 or 3 flights of stairs until they found the fire, and then whatever they could find, they began to beat at the fire. And they did this for 5-10 minutes. Well, then the night watchman, he showed up. Now this guy is trained. He knows how to report a fire, right? You go down and call the fire department with the telegraph firebox. No, he didn't do that. He got it right in with the conductor and the slightly inebriated patrons of the liquor store, and they continued to work on the fire. And that went on for another 5 or 10 minutes, apparently. Well, then a police officer, he was on duty. He walked by. Now, he was well-trained, and the first thing he did was say, "Man, there's a big fire. I need to call a fire alarm." So he did the telegraph fire alarm box and notified the fire department. Now, this is 1880. This is well before automobiles. So this is kind of what that process looked like. So there's your telegraph firebox. You alert the fire department. The firemen have to wake up. They have to come down the pole. They have to get their steamers stoked and get them going. They have to hook up their horses. Got to get the dogs out of the way. Get the ropes down. And then they proceed to the fire. Well, one newspaper said that it took 15 minutes before the fire department arrived. Another newspaper said it took 30 minutes. Well, regardless, by the time the fire department arrived, one entire side of the factory was ablaze. So about that time, firemen were getting set up. The factory manager arrived along with his brother. And so they began to observe how the fire department and the firemen were fighting the fire. And they thought, well, surely they'd be going to one side of the fire in the factory and the other side of the fire in the factory. No, they were just simply shooting up their water hoses up on the brick wall. And on occasion, the water went into the windows and got splashed into the fire just a little bit. So they didn't think that was right. They found the company battalion, and I'm sure they were saying, "Please, sir, go inside the factory and fight the dang fire." No, they didn't appreciate that. Apparently, you don't tell 1880s New York firemen how to fight the fire, because the brother, he was rewarded for his efforts with a rap on the head with a brass nozzle. And the factory manager, one of the firemen hosed him down. He injured his arm. Well, the manager later filed a report with the city, and he said, "Your firemen did not do a very good job. And if there had been better management, we could have saved much of this factory." Well, the fire department captain and fire chief actually, he said, "No, the real problem was you guys waited 30 minutes before you ever sounded the fire alarm. So that was the delay, and that's the reason you lost your factory. So I had to begin to think, surely with as large a fire this is and as famous as it was, somebody took a photograph. But then I thought, this is 1880, and Eastman didn't come out with his Kodak until 1887. Okay. And then I thought, well, surely somebody made a little sketch of it or something. It was a big fire. Everybody in Brooklyn apparently was coming to watch the fire. No, couldn't find a thing. So, with my friends at Artificial Intelligence, this is what I think the factory fire looked like. This is bad. Well, regardless of how that went down, by the next morning, I have no doubt, this is what the factory looked like. Well, some equipment was saved. They were able to get to the other side before the fire progressed, and they pulled out some equipment. But in the early morning, the entire factory was, in fact, in ruins. Well, despite the huge loss, the Ansonia Clock Company was still in pretty good financial shape. They immediately began to rebuild the factory on the same site, and by the end of 1881, they had it operational again. This is a colorized version of that factory. And apparently they did a pretty good job because that factory is still there in Brooklyn. It's not a factory anymore, but they've converted it in the building into apartments. I got to see that about a year or two ago. In 1883, the factory in Ansonia, Connecticut, which was a much smaller factory, they closed and their operations were combined with the Brooklyn factory. Well, some people believe that with the destruction of the first factory in Brooklyn, Ansonia stopped making tower and street clocks in 1880, and that's the reason why they're so rare. But that's not true. I have found advertisements in the mid-1880s regarding their tower and street clocks, and the best evidence is their 1886, 1887 catalog. Clearly, it's into the second factory era. It continues to list the tower and street clocks as shown here. And in the photo, the 2-dial, they actually mentioned a 4-dial street clock we'll talk about in a little bit. And the next Ansonia catalog that I was able to find was the early 1890s. There was no mention of tower and street clocks at that time. I believe that Ansonia wasn't competing effectively with Seth Thomas and E. Howard, and they simply made a business decision to close that business line. And there may have been another reason. While Ansonia made a very beautiful clock, you just saw it, very ornate and very tall, there was a major problem with that clock, and that was the wood dial. They did not protect that wood dial behind glass. Seth Thomas always did that. E. Howard did. In fact, those companies always used a glass dial. But for some reason, they made theirs out of wood. And you saw the access where the shaft goes into the dial, so it was open. Moisture comes in, gets inside the clock, gets into distribution gearing, and it became a huge maintenance issue. Well, rather than do a redesign, I think they just abandoned the venture. I found no evidence that Ansonia ever produced tower and street clocks after 1890. We're going to go back to Quincy, Illinois, and pick up where we left. So we're back to Hines and Rosenthal Jewelers. They set up their street clock in the basement. So there's your movement. There's a horizontal drive shaft that goes to a 90-degree angle, right angle gearing. And then you have a vertical drive shaft that went up through the sidewalk, up into the clock, up to the hands. And that's usually how the Ansonia clocks were set up. A few months ago, I was able to locate a private label pocket watch that had the Hines and Rosenthal name on the dial and the movement. It was made by the Swiss watchmaker Longines. The serial number dates it to 1892. So we know Hines and Rosenthal was doing pretty well during the early 1890s. But then the panic of 1893 hit. You probably think this is a photo from the Depression years, but this is actually 1893, a soup line, if you will. It was a 4-year recession. Unemployment was running about 20%. They said in the cities it was as high as 30, 35%. folks were losing their farms and their businesses. There was precious little money to be spent on jewelry and high-end watches at that time. And if that wasn't bad enough, Joseph Rosenthal took ill, and he passed away in 1894. And the store failed in that same year. Well, there was another jeweler in Quincy, and had been there quite a number of years. I'm sure he admired the beautiful Ansonia Street Clock, and he picked that up and moved it down to his store, which was about a block and a half away. So it's in front of Huffman Jewelers now, and he's 118 North 5th Street. And if you look at that dial, I don't think that dial's looking too good, but it may just be me. And then Huffman also failed under the panic of 1893, and now we have. Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to show you this. This was Huffman's jewelry store in the glory days. He was obviously quite successful. It was an advertisement, so it was a very nice store. But then we had Trask and Plain that picked up Huffman's, and they also assumed possession of the clock. It's not a very good photo. It's the only one that we have. It's dated April 1908. The photographer, I think, was more interested in photographing the guy feeding the pigeons at the time, but that's all we've got. Well, in June of 1908, Arthur F. Odell buys out Trask and Plain Jewelers, and he establishes Odell Jewelers at that same location. Odell's can be seen at the top of the building, and you can begin to see some early automobiles on the streets of Quincy. I had a couple of friends of mine that are automobile enthusiasts. They dated those cars around 1914, 1916. Well, around 1918, W.B. McLean, that was up the way on the other side of the Mississippi in Memphis, Missouri, he heard that the clock was for sale. He went to Quincy, he managed to purchase the clock, and he had it shipped to Memphis, Missouri. Now, this photo was taken in 1920. And then as things moved along, 1947, Harry Laird buys out McLean Jewelry. He renames it the Laird Jewelry Store. Laird assumes possession of the clock, and all going well until March of 1957. There was a tremendous snowstorm in Memphis, Missouri, and so they were trying to clean up the snow. The city maintainer, a road maintainer, came through. He was clearing out the snow around the city square, and he accidentally hit the clock and knocked it down for the very first time. Damaged the cast iron base and a little bit of the frame. Well, the clock was rewelded back together in Iowa, and we know that it made it back onto the streets of Memphis, Missouri, because in May of 1961, there's an advertising that basically says, "Hello, my name is Clock. A few years ago, I had an accident. I was in the hospital for a while." So we know it made it back, and it was restored. Well, in 1969, Harry Laird advertises that his Ansonia Street Clock was for sale. And Mr. Charles Bottom, a private clock collector in Los Alamos, New Mexico, he contacts Laird and he purchases the clock. So the clock is then moved to Los Alamos, and it's erected in Charles Bottom's backyard. I only have one grainy photo. I used AI to enhance that a little bit, but that's what the clock looked like. So then Mr. Bottom decided that he needed to retire, and I think he worked for the Federal Laboratory there, and to move up to the West Coast. So again, the clock was for sale. Well, this time, Stan Good from Tampa, Florida, he comes up, looks at the clock. That's Stan on the left, and the other two folks are Charles and his wife, Esther. Stan clearly bought the clock, begins to disassemble it in some rather questionable ways, but he did manage to get it down, so that was good. Then the clock makes it all the way to Tampa, Florida. So this is Stan and his wife, Dominique. He painted it a nice Tampa blue color. These are photos of Stan in his shop, posing in front of the Ansonia Street Clock. Stan had difficulty keeping the Ansonia clock running in Tampa's humidity. He nicknamed the clock Cantankerous Quincy. Well, Stan frequently used photos of the Ansonia clock in his local advertising. He did clock repairs, and he sold clocks. Well, around 1910, I guess Stan was getting ready to retire. Members of the Tower and Street Clock began to get advertising, emails and so forth from Stan Good. He wanted to sell the clock, but he only wanted $50,000 for it. That was a lot of money, but he made an interesting statement. He said, you know, there's only 3 of these clocks that exist in the entire world. We thought, that's kind of an interesting statement. And we began to do some research, and what we found is it was absolutely true. In Solvang, California, there's the remnants of a 4-dial street clock. Ansonia made very few of these. I think 3, 5, maybe. You can see there's a photo of one in Denver. You can see how ornate that clock was. A lot of ornamentation on it. And the one in Solvang has none of that. And they even added some other stuff on it. I don't know what they were doing. But it doesn't look anything like it did originally. And then there's one in Sedalia, Missouri. It was originally downtown Sedalia, and then it moved out to the suburbs with the jewelry store. Well, apparently they get some high winds up that way because that clock got knocked down 2 or 3 times, and it really damaged the column. It had been welded many, many times, and a lot of that ornamentation you can see is missing. Part of the crest is missing, the banner's missing, so that didn't look anything like that original clock either. And then we had Stan Good's clock. It's there. Everything is there. The crest is there. The banner's there. Everything is there. We thought, okay, but it's still $50,000. Well, Jim and this is where Jim comes into play. Jim and Renee were in Florida. I don't know. Maybe y'all were going to the regional down there, probably. Anyway, they stopped by Tampa to talk to Stan. They called him, and he still wanted $50,000 for that clock, but they did one very smart thing. They left their contact information behind. And that became very important because a few years later, Stan had a heart attack. He was walking into his shop, and he killed over right on the steps, and they had a massive heart attack. Well, that contact information became very important because his wife, Dominique, called the Colsons, and they said, we have sold the property. My children and I, we've sold the property, and we need to get rid of this clock. Would you like to buy it? Well, fortunately for us, Jim contacted the other members of the Tower and Street Clock chapter, and we all talked about it, and we got a hold of Noel Poirier, who was the museum curator at the time, said, no, you really need to go buy this clock. So we convinced him how important this clock was. Noel contacted her, and they negotiated back and forth, but pretty soon they had a buying price of $18,000, which was incredible. So that brings us to January 2014. Chuck Roser, Bob's Roasters, are down in Tampa, Florida. They're taking down the clock. Jim Colson was there. He photographed the whole ordeal, and it got moved all the way up to Columbia. Well, Jim, he also shortened the name. He thought Cantankerous Quincy was a little bit negative. We ought to just call the clock Quincy. And so that's the name we use today. Well, over the next few years, under the direction of Noel Poirier, a lot of important work was completed. Chuck Roser restored the movement and the distribution gearing. Frank Del Greco built a stand to display the movement. Bob DeRochers had the case soda blasted and primed. Lee Davis got involved and did some gold leafing and gilding on the clock. A lot of financial support was being provided by members of the Tower and Street Clock chapter. But then the project along about 2019 stalled. We were trying to find a location within the museum that was suitable for the clock. There was a recommendation that it go into the rotunda, but as you may know, the rotunda is right over a basement, so flooring and holding up a 2,500-pound clock was a bit of an issue. We were looking at ways to support it, and that didn't get much traction. Some of the board members said, well, let's just put the clock outside. Well, we reminded them about the wooden clock issue, so that wasn't going to fly. So instead, the clock lived over at the School of Horology for a few years. And then in 2022, well, you know what happened in 2022? We hired Rory. Rory came on board. He got behind the clock. He was very excited about it. But at first, he didn't have a place to put it either. But what you just heard out there, so one late night after hours, He and Eileen, is it Eileen? Were kicking around what's going to happen with this conservation lab? What do we do with this space? And they put their heads together. They figured out, you know what? We just might be able to get the clock here. We can make a small exhibit area for Quincy, extend it from the public time gallery, which we already have, and that just might work. Of course, then he got a tape measure out and go, uh-oh, it's a little short. It's just a little short by about 18 inches. But said, you know, it might be doable. So that was okay. Then last year, 2025 York National, Roy began to pitch the idea of putting Quincy in that very space. He talked to the board. He talked to our Tower and Street Clock chapter members. And during the open house, we all went over to the School of Horology to see what the heck he was talking about, what we needed to do. That's our own Gary Sertich there looking inside the case of Quincy, making sure that everything was in good shape. He did an excellent job. And then we got Mark Marichek involved. So shortly after, we went back a little bit. That went way back. Here we go. So Mark got involved at the York Regional that occurred in September, and some of the other members were attending the York Regional as well. They began to look at, so what do we really need to do, folks? And the biggest problem was the saddle. It had been broken, obviously, in several places, and very poorly repaired. Well, Mark says, you know what? I can take that back to North Carolina, and I can weld all that, and it'd be perfect. And we said, are you sure? He said, yep, I can do it. So we let him do it, and by golly, did he ever. So Roy started the construction of the gallery. I think this brings us up to about December. In February, Mark had completed his work and installed the saddle onto the head. It looked great. Construction continued on the new gallery. We even found out that Mark knew about concrete, and he drew up this amazing plan and said, here's Quincy's foundation. So, wow, okay. He said, yep, I measured it. You need to drop it 18 inches from the current slab level, but we can do that. So the contractor came along and began to cut out the square that was needed. You may know that the building here originally was on an old industrial dump, if you will. Scrap iron, all kinds of material. And it was amazing what was found in that hole. Rusted iron, burnt out metal. They continued for 9 feet until they finally got to a strong surface down there. So contractor said, no problem, I'll just fill that up with gravel. Then he checked with the concrete company. They said, you know, there's a minimum on concrete. You might as well just fill the whole thing up with concrete. So that's what he did. So I'm convinced that if a tornado ever comes through here and tears the roof off of this museum, Quincy's still going to be there. It's got a heck of a foundation. So in March 26th, the Quincy Gallery is completed. All we need is a Quincy. The arched doorway leading into the public time gallery is open. Everything was well. So then Mark comes through and he said, I've got an idea. I bought these 2 engine stands, which that doesn't look like engine stands to me. And he said, I've turned them into what I call a Quincy rotisserie. And we said, what? He said, yeah, we can mount Quincy to one end and the other end of Quincy to the other. And then as we paint it and gild it, it'll be perfect. I said, okay, Mark, whatever you say. Anyway, so he brought this up in March. He talked, we didn't have any of our members there, but he talked a lot of the NAWCC staff to come down and say, hey, it's kind of like a Tom Sawyer story. Would you like a paintbrush? And they even got Alex working. I've never seen Alex do anything like that. So they painted the clock satin black. The only thing we needed to do was to finish the clock. So in April, 23 people showed up. Some of them from our Tower and Street Clock chapter. Others were members of the NAWCC staff. Roy showed up. There were some local NAWCC volunteers in the area. They showed up. And for 4 days, under Lee Davis's guidance, we gilded and touched up the case. Some of the others were working into the gallery, getting ready for the eventual erection of the clock. So I've got a little slideshow. It only runs for about 2 minutes, but I think by the time we get to the end of that, you'll have a really good idea what happened during Quincy Week. And right behind that is a very, very short time-lapse video. Time you see both of those, I think you really understand what just occurred. There's that rotisserie. Oh, Mark made the dial too. He's very talented. And this is the little time lapse. And as Porky Pig likes to say, that's all, folks.